Welcome to the Georgia Archives Virtual Lunch and Learn program. I'm Penny Cliff, Education Specialist here at the Archives. We're glad that you have joined us for our January presentation, Atlanta's Healthcare History, the History of Early White and Black Hospitals and Medical Professionals with Victoria Lemos. Our Lunch and Learn programs are held on the second Friday of the month and are sponsored by Friends of Georgia Archives and History. Thank you, FOGA, once again. During this pandemic, we want to offer you Lunch and Learn programs safely in a virtual format. As always, I'm thankful that my colleague, Alec Hawthorne, is taking care of the technical side of these virtual presentations. Alec will upload the video of this Lunch and Learn to our YouTube channel, Georgia Archives. Now, if you have friends or family who are unable to watch this presentation live, they don't have to miss out. They can always see them later on YouTube. We are so pleased to have as our New Year Lunch and Learn presenter, Victoria Lemos, who will answer any of your questions at the end of the presentation. Victoria is a New York born and raised child of immigrants who grew up in a bicultural house. It was the duality of that world that sparked her interest in understanding how history and personal stories shape the way we experience our surroundings. After moving to Atlanta in 2007 for work, she began to explore the history that the capital of the South had to offer. 6 years ago, she began volunteering as a walking tour guide and then working as a bicycle tour guide 4 years ago. Somehow, that was not enough to spread her love of history. In August of 2018, she launched her weekly podcast, Archive Atlanta, and I have to tell you, it's really good. Archive Atlanta is a free podcast that covers the stories of Atlanta's people, places, and events with over 100 episodes. We are very happy to welcome Victoria.
Thank you for having me, Penny. I'm excited to be here. And like she said, my podcast has been happening for over 2 years now. And what I tell people is I don't get really in depth. So I'm going to cover a topic that's going to last 20 minutes or less. And my hope is always that I can get more history nerds on board. So maybe you hear something you're interested in and you want to learn more about it. And that is what I want to do today with today's topic, which is Atlanta's healthcare history. And I want to talk about both white and black hospitals and white and black medical professionals. And again, hopefully spark some interest that someone maybe has never heard about. And especially with 2020 being, as you know, don't have to remind anybody that we dealt with a global pandemic. And we talked a lot about our healthcare heroes, a lot about our medical buildings and our medical professionals. And so this could help everybody understand the earliest history of these institutions in the city of Atlanta. So before we get to Atlanta, I just want to start with two places in the state of Georgia. In Savannah, in 1805, we have the first hospital in the entire state, and it was called the Savannah Poorhouse and Hospital Society. It was opened to treat sick sailors, which is not surprising because Savannah was a sail port for ships. Now, the connection that we have to Atlanta, though, is that in 1931, Asa Candler heavily endowed it with his Coca-Cola money, and he named it after his brother, Warren Candler. So the Candler Hospital is actually still standing today. If you go down to Savannah, I can't remember now what street it's on, but it is called the Candler Hospital, and it is believed to be the second oldest general hospital in continuous operation in the entire United States. Now, the Medical College of Georgia was our first medical college in the state that opened in 1828, and it was open to train new physicians. So what people don't realize is that for new physicians to learn, they need cadavers to practice on. And the need for bodies was very high. So this is where we get stories of grave robbing, or resurrection men, as they're called, which I'll explain in a second. And so this college has a really interesting story that I wanted to share, even though it wasn't in Atlanta. Now, most of these cadavers were coming from dead criminals or indigent dead, but even with that system in place, it was very, very difficult to get enough bodies for people to practice. So what the Medical College of Georgia did was that they purchased an enslaved man for themselves. His name was Grandison Harris. They purchased him for $700. He was from Charleston. And his job was specifically to acquire the bodies, preserve the bodies, which was mainly done with alcohol at the time. And then after the students were done, he would dispose of their remains. They actually gave him a house of some kind, structure to live in that was on the edge of the cemetery. So that way he was able to keep an eye on things, if you want to say that. He was able to see fresh burials when they happened, and then start to learn who was able to be dug up without people noticing. And spoiler alert, it was mostly people that were too poor, that had no family, and at that time, they were majority African American. So in 1989, this Medical College of Georgia building, which I think is still standing in Augusta, Georgia today, did some renovations. And in the basement, they found human remains, bones, skeletal remains, and it turns out Grandison had been just dumping them in the basement. Now, after a forensic investigation of that, they determined that 80% of those remains were of Black men. And so I included this photo here because that is a picture of Grandison Harris way back in the doorway, standing with the professors and the teachers at the medical college. So when we start to get into Atlanta, I wanted to talk first about individual healthcare and how it differed based on your race. So for the earliest African Americans in Georgia, they were enslaved and considered property. And so because they were considered property, their owners did want to have them live, but they wanted to spend the smallest amount of money possible on them. And it's estimated that about $3 a year was spent on medical care for each enslaved person. And there was also white scientists and doctors would use these enslaved men, women, and children in medical experiments and procedures. And this definitely happened in our city, in our colleges. Now, if you were white at the time, medical care was still very rudimentary. Hospitals from the 1800s were not associated with a place of care. The way we think of them now is that if we're sick and we need help, we go to a hospital to get better. At that time, they were really a place that you went to die. Now, to give you just a funny story to understand medical care, in 1799, George Washington died of a throat infection. So he had gotten caught in the rain. He didn't change out of his clothes. He got a really bad sore throat. So like I always say, our moms were right. But probably had strep throat, something very minor. But what physicians did was they treated him for the sore throat by draining almost half of his body's blood. They made him drink a mixture of molasses, butter, and vinegar, which he almost choked on, and that was to balance the fluids in his body. So, unsurprisingly, he died a few days later, and this is the level of medical knowledge that we're talking about. Dr. Joshua Gilbert is considered Atlanta's first doctor. So he moved here in 1845, before we were even called Atlanta. We were called Marthasville at the time. He graduated from the Medical College of Georgia in Augusta. He bought a house at Marietta and Forsyth Street, and he opened an office nearby. And the local legend is that he would ride his horse through the area, down your streets, blowing a whistle, and if you needed medical care, you could run out and grab him. He was also a member of the first Board of Health, and he died in 1889. So he is buried at Utoy Cemetery. If you listen to the podcast, I do love cemeteries. I find their final connection for a lot of these stories, so you can still visit his gravesite today. The Atlanta Medical College was our first medical college in the city. Now, it was established with a charter that was granted in 1854, and Dr. John Westmoreland was really the lead on this. So he was really passionate about starting a medical school in the city. He had come to Atlanta. He actually allowed city government to have classes in City Hall. And they said, okay, you know, promise that you're only going to do it in the winter and you're not going to interrupt court proceedings. So they had classes there for a little while. They finally laid the first cornerstone of the building in 1855. And so this is an early drawing of the building. Now, this was able to survive the Civil War and the Battle of Atlanta because of a doctor named Noel Dauvigny. So he was a French man who came to Atlanta, and he was the only doctor that stayed in the city throughout the Battle of Atlanta. And he was imprisoned by the Union Army, but while imprisoned, continued to treat both Union and Confederate soldiers. Now, if there's any Gone with the Wind fans, which I'm sure there are in the South, the scene in the movie where the hospital is overrun and there is a doctor in the scene, it is modeled after Dr. Dauvigny. Now, this medical college also needed bodies, and there was lots of local crazy stories about this. In 1886, the night janitor at the college, his name was George Vaughn, actually entered into an agreement with Joe Smith, who is the sexton at Decatur Cemetery, and they together worked on a plan to get bodies dug up from Decatur and brought to Atlanta for the medical students to work on. Now, they were caught. Vaughn and Smith both pleaded guilty. They were fined. One was fined $100, one was fined $1,000. It was kind of a weird twist of fate is that Smith, who was the sexton at the cemetery, he goes to jail, he develops tuberculosis, he gets out, he moves to Atlanta, and he never really recovers. So he's had health issues for the next few years. And he decides that he wants to donate his body to science, maybe making amends, I'm not sure. But the thing is that the Atlanta Medical College does not want a body that has tuberculosis. So his body was rejected, but they felt bad. So they raised money and they decided to pay for his burial at Westview Cemetery. Now, Spelman Nursing School starts, actually, let me back up for 1 second. In 1852, in Augusta, there is the first hospital that's built solely for the care of Black patients, and it had an all-white medical staff. In 1865, the first African-American woman with a medical degree graduates in Boston, but that's all outside of the Atlanta area. So in Atlanta, in 1886, the first nursing school for Black students starts at Spelman College, and Spelman had just been established 5 years earlier in 1881. So caring for the poor had become an issue in almost every city, and what the leadership of Atlanta decided to do is that they came up with a system to take 6 physicians that were in private practice, and they assigned them each to the 6 wards of the city. So Atlanta at that time was broken out into 6 wards, 6 doctors. They get an annual salary, but this is before cars, before public transportation. So these physicians are using horses or horse and buggies in addition to their real jobs. You can imagine it's not overly effective. They're trying to care for their patients, and then they're also trying to see people that need their help. Unsurprisingly, the death rate for Black Atlantans was 2.5 times greater than it was for whites. And early Atlanta, just kind of give you an idea, it did not have many paved roads. I don't think any yet at that point. There was no city sewers, waterways. Neighborhoods were very much created based on physical landscape. So the higher up you were, if you lived near a natural spring, that was decidedly a white residential neighborhood. And then low-lying land and alleyways, things where outhouse runoff would go, that was a Black settlement. And so that helps to understand why the death rate was so much higher. Now, there was a hospital in downtown called Central Ivy Street Hospital that opened in 1883. That was the first hospital that even accepted Black patients. But within the first 5 years of being open, There was investigations into the care of the patients, and it just became a huge issue, and it shut down not too soon after. So the city needs a solution. How are we going to care for the poor of Atlanta? And that solution was Grady Hospital. Now, the cornerstone for Grady Hospital was laid in 1890, and it did not get built right away. So there was the grand plan, but there wasn't really the money needed to fund this. Now, James English, many men were involved in the building of Grady, but James English, who owned Chattahoochee Brick and had access to convict leasing, he actually used convict leasing to grade this lot. That saved them about $3,000. Still not enough money, construction stalled for 1 year. And Joseph Hirsch, who is kind of considered the father of Grady, he raised the remaining money to open this. Now, people wonder about, I think, the Henry Grady connection, like, did he have anything to do with it? And he didn't. He died just before Christmas the year prior. So this was really just an honorific title. They wanted to name the hospital after him because they thought he was such an important Atlantan. Initially, the plan was it was going to be a white hospital, but there was going to be 3 wards for Black residents facing the back, facing on Jenkins Street. And the idea was that these wards would be temporary. They were going to build a real Black hospital soon. It wasn't going to be a problem. Unsurprisingly, that didn't really happen. In 1892, it officially opened. The first patient of Grady Hospital was rejected for 2 reasons. He was not a resident of Atlanta, and he was considered an incurable. So at that time, if you had a disease that was considered incurable, maybe cancer, you were not taken at the hospital. There were separate homes called homes for the incurables. So first person is rejected. The first accepted patient of Grady Hospital was a Black railroad employee named Alan Kimball. And the fun story is that he never left. After being treated, he returned to work as an orderly, and he eventually became the ambulance driver. Now, shortly after Grady opens, the National Medical Association is formed in Atlanta. Now, this is the nation's oldest and largest organization for African American physicians, and Black doctors had been barred from joining the American Medical Association. So there was, in 1895, Atlanta held the Cotton States and International Exposition, which is a huge kind of World's Fair at Piedmont Park. And there was a separate Negro building, they called it. And so at that fair, there was initial discussions about starting this organization. Officially, the men met in this church down here, which is First Congregational, which still stands in downtown Atlanta. And here is where they formed this organization. Now, these 2 men, Dr. Henry Butler and Dr. Thomas Slater, are considered the fathers of the organization. They also went on to open the first Black pharmacy in Atlanta. They hired the first Black pharmacist, who's Moses Amos. And actually, Butler's wife, Selena Sloan Butler, has her own amazing history. She started the PTA. Dr. Eliza Greer, her name changes sometimes in history, so it's Eliza Ann, sometimes she's written as Annie. We have very little information about her, but I did want to highlight her because she is considered the first Black woman to practice medicine in Georgia. She came to Atlanta in 1897 after graduating from the Women's Medical College, which I think is in Pennsylvania, and she sits for the Board of Medical Examiners here. There's a wonderful write-up about her in the paper, about how she passed with flying colors. She got 100 on all her tests, but it was not only, if you can imagine, difficult to be a woman practicing medicine in 1897, add to that a Black woman practicing medicine. So she had financial issues keeping up her practice, just being able to fund that. And so she only practices for a few years. She ends up moving out of the state, and she dies shortly thereafter. So I want to talk about death rates because this helps us understand all of the institutions we're about to see. In 1900, the Black death rate exceeded the white by 69%. And African-American deaths accounted for half of the city's deaths, but they were only 40% of the population. 45% of Black babies didn't see their first birthday, and the really sad part is that they're dying from completely preventable diseases. And like I said, mainly caused by polluted water because of their residential patterns. And so because of all this stuff, Black medical staff begin to open their own facilities. Grady is not a place of care for the Black community. So the first one to open is in 1900 on the campus of Spelman College was Matticker Hospital. And this building still stands. I think it's a student center of some kind today. But it was a public 30-bed training hospital. And 14 years prior, Spelman had done their first nursing school for African Americans in the US. They opened this, and Ludy Clay Andrews was the superintendent here, but she was also the first African-American registered nurse in Georgia, and she actually went on to later start the nursing school for Black nurses at Grady. Georgia Dwell there's also not a whole lot of information about her because she was in Atlanta for a short time, but she was a Spelman graduate. At the turn of the century, she was one of 3 Black women practicing medicine in Georgia. And in 1906, so also the year of the Atlanta Race Massacre, she opens Dwell Infirmary on Boulevard. Now the building no longer exists, but it was really important because she focused mainly on OBGYN practice and treating children. And like I said earlier, almost half of African American children are dying from preventable diseases. Now, it was sometimes called the Dwell Infirmary or the Dwell Sanatorium, and it was open for actually a few decades, but then it was closed. All right, Piedmont Hospital, I think many Atlantans are familiar with, but probably not in this iteration. In 1905, it was opened as the Piedmont Sanatorium in the former mansion of Charles Swift, and that's the photo you're seeing here. And it was located in Washington-Rawson neighborhood, which does not exist anymore. It was removed during urban renewal, so sort of the area where former Turner Field is and the connector. It was opened by an Austrian man named Dr. Ludwig Amster. He was the owner. And then he hired Dr. Floyd McRae, who was in charge of the surgical department. So what this sort of was Dr. McRae's patients. There was only 8 to 10 beds. And so they were able to come here, and they were brought here by horse-drawn ambulance. Now, very quickly, it became very popular. In 1909, there was a new building that was designed by A. Tennant Brown, which is one of my favorite architects, and that was put into the back side of the lot. But it really expanded many more times after this in 1921, 1922. It's known for having Atlanta's first electrocardiograph happened here. And essentially, it had expanded into several buildings until finally the name changing to Piedmont Hospital and moving up to where we know it today on Peachtree Road. The Davis Fisher Sanatorium may be familiar to some people as Crawford Long, but it originally opened in that same Washington-Rawson area in 1908. Now, it moved to Linden Avenue, where it is now. This building is still there now, in 1911. And then it wouldn't be until 1931 that they changed the name to Crawford Long. Now, Crawford Long, at least for me, I was like, oh, he must be really important in Atlanta. He only lived in Atlanta for 1 year in 1851. He is credited with discovering the use of anesthesia for surgeries, although he wasn't given credit until way after his death. But he was such an important doctor that they named the facility after him. And then today we know it as Emory University Hospital. So this historic building still stands, but the modern Emory is in front of it. Now, this is a hospital that I had never heard of until I found a small mention of it, but it was Fairhaven Infirmary. And this was opened in 1909 by 6 African-American doctors, and it was located on the campus of Morris Brown. But this is when Morris Brown was still located in the 4th Ward. So right at Boulevard, when you come off the connector there, that was the campus. Now, it was open because this was the only place where Black surgeons and physicians could hospitalize their patients. If you think about it, if you're treating someone at home or in a small office and they need more care, there was nowhere for them to send them. So it was only a 12-bed capacity. It had 1 operating room, but it was able to train Black surgeons, and also white physicians were able to place their Black patients there, which again, during segregation, they could not put them in any other hospital. So Grady Hospital is expanding from that original building on the left. They finally got their first motorized ambulance. So this is a historical photo of their horse-drawn ambulance. And if you can imagine, a horse carriage covering 26 miles was inefficient. And so in 1911, their first motorized ambulance was a pretty big deal. But of course, there's a funny story connected to everything. On its first run, it gets stuck on the railroad tracks in Kirkwood and it gets hit by a train. Everybody was okay, it just demolished it. And so they had to borrow the motorized ambulance from the funeral home for a few months while they got a new one. Now, if you've been in Atlanta long enough, a lot of people talk about the Two Gradys, and the Two Gradys starts in 1911. So by 1911, before 1911, the African-American wards that I talked about earlier, they're at capacity, they're in terrible condition. They are turning away 20 people a day. There's people in hallways and closets. There's bad lighting. There's falling ceilings. There is no maternity ward for Black women. And they had opened, or they had thought about opening a new hospital that never materialized. So in 1911, the city approves opening this new ward. It was going to be 110 beds. But the thing is, this new building was going to be white only. So all of the white patients moved into this new annex, and then the former building would be used for Black patients. Now, this is where we get the Gradys. There would literally be a white Grady Hospital and a Black Grady Hospital up until the 1960s. And this building was demolished, and I can't remember the year, but it no longer stands. Now, Scottish Rite, you may know it better by Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, but it did start as Scottish Rite Convalescent Home for Crippled Children, opened in 1915 with 18 beds. And so this photo on the left is the first buildings that it started with. And then 4 years later, they hired architect Neil Reed to design a 50-bed institution for them, which is this building here. Now, these buildings still stand. They're used for another purpose, but in 1998, everything merged together, and we know it today as Children's Healthcare of Atlanta. So in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, you see the opening of private hospitals for Atlanta's African-American population. And that's because, like I said earlier, Grady was segregated and it was still considered a hospital for the poor. So in 1928, the Harris Memorial Hospital opens. And this is one of my favorite buildings because it was the brainchild of a woman. Sadie Harris Powell, she was born Sadie Powell, was born in Atlanta in 1889. And her parents, William and Aurelia Harris, her father was actually a teacher at first. He went to Meharry Medical College, and he practiced medicine in Atlanta for a really long time. So this was named in his honor. She went to Spelman High School. She graduated from a training school, a nursing training school in Chicago. And when she came back, she was actually head nurse at Fairhaven Infirmary, which we just talked about. 1918, 1919, she married surgeon Charles Powell. So together, they opened one of the few privately held hospitals for Black Atlantans. They never had children, so I always say maybe this was their child. Charles would perform the surgeries, and Sadie acted as superintendent. She ran the entire building. In 1939, Charles Powell actually died while operating here. So he was operating all night long. He had stopped at 4 a.m. He picked back up at 8 a.m. and he just collapsed on the operating room floor. Sadie continued to operate it for a short time. She was really active in the community, though. In 1943, she was Woman of the Year in Business. She headed a campaign, an anti-tuberculosis campaign in the 40s. She was a YMCA member, and she died in 1964 and is buried at Oakland Cemetery. Now, another story that's related to this building. So I did an episode about this newspaper, but the Atlanta Daily World was the first Black daily newspaper in the country. And W.A. Scott, who was the originator of the paper, he was shot, he lived just down the street. He was shot by an unknown assailant and brought here by his neighbor. So, I mean, for me, it was interesting to see how these buildings connect to their surroundings. So his neighbor drives him here. It was a dramatic story, but no one knew who shot him. He'd gotten a kind of a letter from the shooter sent to the hospital, so he was really worried about it. He actually transferred to Matticker, which was on Spelman's campus that we just talked about, and it was there that he passed away a week later. So McLeod Hospital, similar to Harris, it was open though in 1946. Dr. Frederick Earl McLeod was from Washington, Georgia. He attended Morehouse. He left to go to medical school at Meharry. And he comes back to Atlanta to serve, the underserved Black community. So if you were Black in Atlanta in 1945, 1946, there was a scarcity of beds. 100,000 Black people didn't qualify for care at Grady. 100,000. And there was only 44 beds in the city that were considered non-charity. So 100,000, 44. And he saw that need and he opened this up. This was originally 3 buildings. So this is the only building that's left remaining, but it started on a small building on the corner that was about 7,000 square feet. It had 4 beds. And then over a period of a few years, it expanded to 30,000 square feet and 75 beds. And this also served as a training hospital. They trained 50 African-American doctors and 400 white doctors. It was considered, I think, technically considered a private hospital for middle to upper middle class African Americans, but it did also treat the poor, so it couldn't get into another institution. It's one of its most famous patients was Benjamin E. Mays, who was president of Morehouse, and McLeod actually lived around the corner from here before moving to Collier Heights. So I think this, for me here today, the story ends with desegregation because I told you we had 2 Gradys up until 1962, and that is when U.S. Supreme Court orders the desegregation of Grady, but that's not when it actually happened. So the Hugh Spalding Pavilion, again, if you've lived in Atlanta long enough, you'll know about it, but it was considered kind of the Black Grady. They hired Dr. Asa Yancey there to direct that in 1958, but full integration of Grady Hospital did not happen until 1965. And so after that, especially into the 70s, all of these small neighborhood hospitals like McLeod had officially closed because I think essentially there was not a need for it. But we still have these major players like Grady and Piedmont Hospital and Crawford Long and their iterations that are now medical institutions in the city of Atlanta. So you want to do some questions?
Yes. Okay, we have a question here. Did Eliza Greer practice in Atlanta, and where is she buried?
Yes, she did practice in Atlanta, so only for 2 years. So 1897, I don't know where her practice was, and she died in North Carolina and is buried there, so not here. sadly, I know.
Also, where did you find all the information and photographs on the hospitals and the professionals?
So a lot of these are from the newspaper, especially the Grady annexes and stuff. Any kind of big news like that, they would commission a drawing for it. And a lot of the other people are on, like the National Medical Association has their pictures, and there's actually great photos on Find a Grave, believe it or not. So when you look up specific people and where they're buried, there'll be photos there too.
Okay, we have another question. Did Dr. Eliza Greer studied in Pennsylvania?
Yes.
But she came to Georgia to practice. Do you know the story behind that?
I don't. So I'm very fascinated by her. I always had her on my notes, but not a lot of information, and now I know why, because there's not a lot of information. I don't know. Trying to rack my. I want to say she may have been born in Augusta, so there might have been some kind of family connection, but I don't know why. And maybe it was because. So if you take everything into consideration, Spelman had started the nursing school, the National Medical Association had started 2 years prior. So there was very much a community here that I think she could work with and talk to and relate to.
Don't think we have any more questions, but let's say we have one says, thank you for the wonderful presentation. I don't think we have any more right now. But I want to thank Victoria for a fantastic presentation. As I said, you can find her podcast, Archive Atlanta. I highly recommend it. Next month's Lunch and Learn presentation is scheduled for Friday, February the 12th. Our speaker will be author Robert C. Jones, whose program is Colonial Georgia, the Oglethorpe Years. Thank you so much for joining us.